Hello and welcome to the Finance Quarter. I'm Andrew Robertson. On the program today, how employers can get the best out of Gen Y. It's not as hard as they might think. And it might be the season for Goodwill, but Goodwill on a balance sheet can be a problem for shareholders. But first today, another problem for many shareholders, and that's the super high pay packets of executives. Big bonuses are being paid even when shareholders have suffered big losses. And for some who follow corporate governance closely, it's time for radical action to rein in the excess. Shareholders largely turned a blind eye to executive pay when the economy was booming, but it's not booming now, and a string of high protest votes against this year's remuneration reports reveals many shareholders have had enough.
We're presently seeing results of companies where executives are getting paid substantial bonuses for loss-making ventures and questionable business strategies where shareholders are actually losing a lot of money.
BlueScope Steel and One Steel are two examples of companies continuing to pay big bonuses as shareholders have suffered big losses. Others, such as Commonwealth Bank, Wesfarmers and QR National, reset missed bonus targets to make them easier. The big question is how to stop that seemingly unjustified transfer of wealth from shareholders to management.
We find that in France and Germany and in Japan, people run big, complex organisations for far less money than Americans and Australians and the English increasingly pay themselves.
Professor Jack Gray from the Centre for Market Dysfunctionality at the University of Technology in Sydney believes the reason executives in Australia are so highly paid is that there's no genuine market for their services.
Markets work best when they're both sides, sellers and buyers, have equal information and equal power. And here is a case where the information is only one-sided and the power is only one-sided because shareholders are too diffuse.
Which for Professor Gray means in Australia all the power rests with people such as remuneration consultants, directors and the executives themselves, who all have a vested interest in pay being as high as possible. Professor Gray thinks it's time for boards to stand up for their shareholders and instead of trying to hang on to executives at any cost, be prepared to let them leave if they're not happy with their remuneration. I have a confession to make. I'm a young baby boomer. And whilst I'm also confessing, I have to admit that we baby boomers aren't the future anymore. That role is increasingly passing to Gen Y, people born from the early 1980s to the late 1990s. And one more confession, we baby boomers often don't understand Gen Y, which means if we're employing Gen Y, it can often be a clash of cultures. Well, one man who does understand Gen Y, and that's because he's one of them, is social researcher Michael McQueen. Michael, it's often been said that when a Gen Y person applies for a job at the interview, it's actually the employer that gets interviewed and not the potential employee. Why is that?
Well, it's mainly because when Generation Y enter the workplace and right throughout their latter part of schooling, particularly those who graduated sort of 1999 through to 2005 or 6, they really entered a workplace that needed them. They entered an era when we had skill shortages and war for talent. And therefore this perception was, it's almost like, well, my employer needs me, I've got skills to offer. And so to an extent, I'm going to call the shots. And for older generations, that was very off-putting because it was almost like they had to sell themselves to a potential employee. And one HR manager once shared with me that she was in an interview with a series of young people in a panel, and the question they asked was, why should I work for you? And she was taken aback by that because she said, I would never have asked that when I was a young employee, but this group do.
Well, they're clearly then very different to either, say, young baby boomers or even Gen X. So how should employers deal with that?
Well, I think they need to realise that the reason Generation Y are the way they are is because of how they've been raised. I find it so interesting that the people who complain the most about Gen Y are the baby boomers, and yet Gen Y are the children of the baby boomers. And so think of how boomers raise their kids. They raise their kids knowing their rights, having a voice, being unafraid to use their voice to ask for what they want. And now that they do all of these things, they complain about them. So I think the important point is to start by looking to understand. That idea of seek to understand before you seek to be understood. So what is it that makes this group tick, rather than casting judgments like they're arrogant or presumptuous or entitled. So I was looking at some of the things that have happened in this group's formative years that have led to some of the behaviours they've got.
Well, if you can just expand on that, what should an enlightened employer do to get the best out of Gen Y?
I think the first thing is to realise that with this group, if you've already got them working for you, the relationship is the key. For Generation Y, relationship is the key to loyalty. They won't be loyal to companies or brands or employers, they'll be loyal to people. And so, they've typified that old phrase, I don't care how much you know until I know how much you care. And so the importance of building a relationship once you've got them working for you, but also to involve them, to actually ask for their opinion, to get their input. This is a group who love to be involved in the discussion, as opposed to older generations who would perhaps say to a young team member, once you've earned the right to be heard, then you can speak up. Whereas this group are coming in and they want to be heard. They're not necessarily arrogant or presumptuous, but they just want to be in the mix. So to empower them, to get them involved in decision making, give them some ownership over their work and their output. And if you do that, it's amazing how much commitment and energy and innovation they'll bring to it.
It sounds like in a nutshell they want respect right from day one.
Yeah. Actually, respect is an interesting one because you hear it said that Gen Y don't care about respect. And yet one thing we found in our research is that respect for this group is the currency of relationship. If you remember 10 years ago, what did teenagers say? There was that phrase, don't diss me, which basically means don't disrespect me. And so respect is critical, and the way you earn respect with this group is it's got to be reciprocal, it's got to go both ways, and it's got to be based in relationship. They'll respect you as a manager or a parent or a school teacher because of the relationship you've built with them, not just because of your title, your age, or your years of experience.
Just finally then, as a prospective employer or maybe even a current employer of a Gen Y person or people, what are 3 things you shouldn't do with Gen Y?
I think the first one is don't look too far out. If you've got a young employee and you're looking to, grow them over 5, 10, 15 years, they probably won't stay there that long. And so shorten the time horizons. When it comes to coaching this group, set short-term challenging goals. So what are you going to do this month or in the next 3 months, as opposed to at an annual performance review, what are you going to do over the next 12 months? That's probably the first thing. That also has an impact on really practical things like rostering. Because if you're an employer wanting to find out your employees' unavailabilities, the Gen Y employees' unavailabilities for the next 6 weeks, they don't know when they're going to be unavailable because they haven't set the social schedule up yet. They're very reactive in the way they plan. So the first thing is don't look too far out. The second thing would be don't focus on compliance. So often within workplaces it's all about you should, you must, do it now, we expect. And that sort of language doesn't work well with this group. It puts them offside, it I guess, estranges rather than engages them very, very quickly. And so rather than compliance, focus on commitment. Give them a reason to do something, the benefits, some of the things of what's in it for me, as opposed to this is what we expect. And the third thing would be focus on the outcome, not the process. Process is about what and how. Success formulas, sacred cows, the things we've always done that way. And Gen Y will come into an organisation where there's a heavy focus on how we've always done things, and they ask why. And so answer that question. Be aware that maybe some of the processes you've got in place don't connect with an outcome anymore. Things have moved on, times have changed, and maybe you need to be flexible around that as well. So focus on what's the purpose, what's the outcome, why are we doing this, rather than what we do and how we do it.
Well, Michael, I'm sure there's a lot of employers watching this who found that very helpful. Thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
This is the annual report of One Steel, and it makes very interesting reading. When you look at the balance sheet, at the end of the financial year, the company had $5.6 billion in non-current assets, of which $2.4 billion, or about 43%, was goodwill. Now, goodwill is an intangible asset, and it often represents a premium paid for acquisitions over and above the physical value of those assets purchased. But it's something you really should consider if you're thinking of investing in a company with lots of goodwill on its books.
There are 2 types of goodwill. There's economic goodwill, which is the good goodwill, and there's accounting goodwill, which is the bad goodwill. Economic goodwill comes about in businesses that have the ability to generate customer loyalty, have a fantastic reputation, and generally want to make people pay more for their product or even cross the road to buy a product from them when there's a cheaper alternative on this side of the road. Economic goodwill is something that is intangible. Accountants can't put their finger on it, and you won't find it on a company's balance sheet. But where you will see it is in a company's very high rate of return on its equity. Companies with high rates of return on equity generally have an asset that isn't on the balance sheet. It's not on the balance sheet because accountants haven't worked out how to value it, and when it's not on the balance sheet, competitors can't copy it. Accounting goodwill, which is the bad goodwill, is the goodwill you do find on a balance sheet. It's been constructed by accountants. It's a way of explaining where the additional money went that was paid for a business. So if a business has $50 million worth of hard assets, tangible assets, buildings and equipment, but it is bought for $100 million, then the company that acquired that business will also have $50 million of accounting goodwill. But here's the problem. If return on equity is low, if a great return isn't generated from the purchase of that business, then that accounting goodwill is responsible. I like to think of accounting goodwill as, oops, I paid too much. Pay too much for a business and you'll get a low return in that business. And if you own shares in that business, you'll end up with a low return from those shares in time as well.
The challenge for investors is how do you know that the goodwill really is worth what the company says? Now, to use One Steel as an example again, management of One Steel concedes its level of goodwill is a concern.
At the moment we have a number of our business segments that are clearly underperforming and providing unacceptable results. So that's a concern that's certainly held by management and the board. It's not just the shareholders that have that concern, and that's what we're focused on trying to address.
I guess you couldn't give any guarantees that that goodwill won't be written down at some time in the future.
I guess most people, certainly I learnt in the GFC, you never say never to anything.
Now, I'm not having a go at One Steel, but if, for example, they did write off the value of that goodwill on their balance sheet, their share price would take a big hit. And that's the trap for people who invest in companies with a lot of goodwill. Well, that's all for this edition of the Finance Quarter. As always, if you'd like to see any part of the program again, you can find us on the ABC News website. Just go to the business page and click on the Finance Quarter icon. If you'd like to contact us, we're on Twitter at the address on your screen now, and our email address is thefinancequarter@your.abc.net.au. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on the Finance Quarter.